hum of the international airport was a familiar symphony to most travelers. Rushed footsteps, the clatter of rolling suitcases, the faint buzz of overhead announcements cutting through the chaos. But on this day, that rhythm broke. A sharp, unmistakable sound sliced through the air, a slap, crisp and jarring, followed by the clatter of an umbrella hitting the polished floor. Every head turned, every breath caught. In the midst of the bustling VIP line, an elderly woman stood frozen, her silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light, her hand trembling slightly where it had been struck. Above her loomed Miss Carter, the flight attendant, her face a mask of irritation, her name tag glinting like a badge of misplaced authority. "I told you to step aside," she snapped, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. The woman, Margaret Holloway, didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or shrink away. Instead, she bent slowly, her frail fingers reaching for the umbrella that now lay discarded at her feet, a symbol of her dignity cast aside. As she straightened, her piercing blue eyes met Miss Carter's with a quiet intensity that made the younger woman falter for just a heartbeat. The crowd held its breath, waiting for tears, for anger, for something to break the unbearable tension. But Margaret's voice, when it came, was steady, soft, and chillingly calm. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," she said. The words hung there, heavy and unshakable, like a storm cloud rolling in over a clear sky. Miss Carter scoffed, shifting her weight as if to dismiss them, but something in Margaret's gaze, a depth, a certainty made her pause. The passengers around them stood transfixed, their hurried lives forgotten, drawn into a moment they couldn't quite understand, but couldn't look away from either. Before we dive deeper, let me ask, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below, and if this story grips you the way I hope it will, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. The scene had started innocently enough. Earlier that morning, the VIP lounge hummed with its usual understated elegance. Soft clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations between well-dressed travelers sipping overpriced coffee. Near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, Margaret Holloway sat alone. She wore a simple emerald green coat, her silver hair swept into a neat bun, her hands resting gently on the curved handle of her umbrella. To anyone passing by, she was just another elderly woman traveling solo, her presence blending seamlessly into the crowd. Planes roared into the sky beyond the glass, and she watched them with a serene expression, as if she'd seen it all 1,000 times before, and maybe she had. A young businessman, Ethan Brooks, sat a few seats away, his sharp suit and polished shoes marking him as one of the VIP cabin's usual suspects. He glanced at Margaret, noting the quiet grace in her posture, and with a polite smile he stood. "Ma'am, would you like my seat? It's closer to the gate," he offered, his voice warm but professional. Margaret turned to him, her eyes crinkling slightly at the corners, as she smiled back. "That's very kind of you, young man," she said softly, "but I'm fine right here." Ethan nodded, a little charmed by her gentle refusal, and sat back down. Most people didn't give her a second glance after that, just another gray-haired traveler, unremarkable in the sea of faces. But oh, how wrong they were. At the check-in counter, the flight attendants moved with brisk efficiency, their voices clipped as they directed passengers through the boarding process. Among them stood Miss Carter, tall and imposing, her sharp features framed by a tightly pulled ponytail. She'd been working the VIP cabin for years, and she carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew she belonged there more than anyone else. Her eyes scanned the lounge with a practiced precision, sizing up the passengers, who fit the mold of VIP and who didn't. When her gaze brushed over Margaret, it lingered for barely a second before sliding away. An elderly woman in a plain coat? She didn't register. Miss Carter's attention stayed fixed on the executives in tailored suits, the high-profile travelers she deemed worthy of her time. When the boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, "VIP cabin passengers, please proceed to the gate," Margaret rose slowly, adjusting her grip on her umbrella. Her steps were steady, unhurried, as if time bent to her will rather than the other way around. The line parted slightly as she approached, though most passengers barely noticed, too busy fumbling with their tickets or jostling for position. She reached the counter and handed her boarding pass to Miss Carter, who took it with a quick, dismissive flick of her wrist. Without even glancing at it properly, Miss Carter held up a hand. "Ma'am, this is the VIP line," she said, her tone polite but edged with impatience.
Margaret looked up at her, her expression unreadable. "Yes, I know," she replied, her voice as gentle as a whisper on the wind. Miss Carter sighed, her patience already fraying. She glanced down at the boarding pass, her brow furrowing as she saw the seat number, right in the VIP cabin. It didn't add up. She tilted her head, her voice taking on a condescending lilt. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" she asked, as if Margaret might have stumbled into the wrong line by accident. Margaret didn't bristle. She didn't snap back. "I'm quite sure," she said simply, her calm unshaken. Miss Carter pressed her lips into a thin line, glancing over Margaret's shoulder as if expecting someone, a caretaker, a family member, to step forward and explain the mix-up. But no one did. Margaret stood alone, her umbrella tapping lightly against the floor as she waited. Miss Carter shook her head, her tone sharpening. "There might have been an error. The VIP cabin is reserved for certain passengers. Economy boarding is that way." She pointed toward the other gate, her patience visibly thinning. Margaret didn't budge. She met Miss Carter's gaze with that same serene expression. "There is no mistake," she said after a pause. "This is my seat." Miss Carter's jaw tightened. She'd seen this before. Passengers trying to sneak into the VIP cabin with fake tickets. Upgrades they hadn't earned. She had no time for it. With a sharp exhale, she held the boarding pass up to the light, squinting at it as if it were a forgery. "I don't know how you got this," she muttered, more to herself than to Margaret. "But you can't sit here." The line behind them grew restless. A few passengers craned their necks to watch, some curious, others annoyed at the delay. Ethan Brooks, the businessman who'd offered Margaret his seat, shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his briefcase. Another woman, Clara Morton, stood nearby, her hand hovering near her mouth as she watched the exchange unfold. Miss Carter's voice grew firmer, colder. "I don't have time for this. Step aside." Margaret still didn't move. Her silence, her stillness, it was infuriating. Miss Carter's patience snapped like a taut wire. In a sudden, sharp motion, she slapped Margaret's hand away from the counter. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the quiet gate. Margaret's umbrella slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor with a hollow thud. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Clara Morton's hand flew to her lips, her eyes wide with shock. Ethan stiffened, his breath catching as if he'd been struck himself. But Miss Carter didn't flinch. "I told you to move," she said, her voice ice-cold. Margaret bent down slowly, her movements deliberate, her hands steady despite the tremor that should have been there. She retrieved her umbrella, rising with a grace that belied her age, and fixed Miss Carter with a look that could have stopped a heart. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Margaret spoke those chilling words. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Miss Carter laughed, a short, brittle sound, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, I don't have time for games," she said, her voice dripping with impatience. "If you don't move, I'll call security to escort you out." The crowd murmured louder now. Ethan clenched his jaw, debating whether to intervene. Clara looked around, her eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to step in. But no one did. They just watched, waiting to see how far this would go. Margaret remained unshaken, her umbrella now gripped with a quiet confidence. "I am sitting in the VIP cabin," she said, her voice still soft but unyielding, "and I am boarding this flight." Miss Carter's patience evaporated. "Unbelievable," she muttered, turning to a younger flight attendant nearby. "Sophie, call security." Sophie hesitated, her wide eyes darting between Miss Carter and Margaret. Something about the older woman's calm didn't sit right. She wasn't flustered, wasn't scrambling to explain herself. She was too steady, too sure. But Miss Carter's glare brooked no argument. Before Sophie could reach for the intercom, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Every head turned. Victor Ramsey, a senior airline official, strode toward them, his suit impeccable, his badge gleaming under the lights. His face was a mask of professionalism, but there was an undeniable weight to his presence. He didn't spare Miss Carter a glance as he addressed Margaret directly. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his tone laced with quiet respect, "apologies for the delay. Your seat is waiting." Miss Carter blinked, her mouth parting slightly before snapping shut. "Wait, what?" Victor finally turned to her, his expression cool as steel. "Step aside, Miss Carter." The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Carter swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. Her fingers tightened around the boarding pass still in her hand, crumpling it slightly. "There has to be some mistake," she said, forcing a strained laugh. "I mean, she—" Victor's sharp gaze silenced her. "There is no mistake," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of finality. "Step aside." Sophie, still frozen, felt her stomach drop. This wasn't a mix-up. Clara Morton exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Ethan, the crowd's whispers growing into a low hum of speculation. Miss Carter's face flushed hot, her confidence unraveling as she looked between Victor and Margaret. The elderly woman stood there, composed as ever, watching the scene unfold with an enigmatic calm that made Miss Carter's nerves fray even further. Trying to regain control, she squared her shoulders. "I was just following protocol," she insisted. "There was an issue with the ticket." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Did you check the system before removing her from the line?" Miss Carter faltered. She had scanned the ticket, yes, but she hadn't bothered to verify it. She'd assumed, and now that realization twisted like a knife in her gut. Victor didn't wait for her answer. "Escort Mrs. Holloway to her seat," he instructed Sophie, his tone leaving no room for debate. Sophie nodded quickly, stepping forward. "Right this way, ma'am," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Margaret gave Miss Carter one last lingering look, a look that carried more weight than words ever could, before turning to follow Sophie through the boarding tunnel. Her umbrella tapped lightly against the floor with each step, the sound echoing in Miss Carter's ears like a metronome counting down to her undoing. The crowd parted for Margaret, their eyes following her as if drawn by some invisible force. Miss Carter stood there, her pulse hammering, every pair of eyes in the gate burning into her like a spotlight. Victor took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "When this flight takes off, I suggest you prepare for a very serious conversation." Her knees nearly buckled. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her, the unshakable confidence she'd worn like armor crumbling into dust. Victor turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the center of the storm she'd created. The other passengers slowly returned to their own worlds, but a few still cast curious glances her way, their whispers following her like shadows. Sophie guided Margaret through the boarding tunnel, her movements careful, almost reverent. Unlike Miss Carter, she hadn't dismissed the older woman, not entirely. There was something about Margaret's presence, something different, and now, with Victor's intervention, Sophie was sure of it. "I'm so sorry about that, ma'am," she said quietly as they reached the VIP cabin. "I should have stepped in sooner." Margaret settled into her seat with practiced ease, resting her umbrella beside her. "It's quite all right, dear," she said, adjusting her coat. "I've dealt with worse." Sophie hesitated, lowering her voice. Who are you exactly?" Margaret's eyes twinkled with something unreadable, but she didn't answer. She simply leaned back, comfortable in a way that suggested she belonged there more than anyone else. Sophie didn't press further, though curiosity gnawed at her. She nodded and stepped away, leaving Margaret to her silence. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Miss Carter forced herself to move, her steps stiff and robotic as she retreated to the galley, She needed air, space, a moment to think. What had just happened? Why had Victor reacted like that? Why had that old woman walked away with such unshakable certainty? She reached for a cup of water, her hands trembling so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim. Before she could steady herself, the intercom crackled to life. "Miss Carter, please report to the cockpit immediately." The cup crumpled in her grip, water spilling across her fingers. Her throat went dry. She'd never been called to the cockpit before a flight, not like this. Whatever was waiting for her, it wasn't good. Her legs felt like lead as she made her way forward, each step heavier than the last. The cabin blurred around her, passengers settling into their seats, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. She stepped into the cockpit, and the air hit her like a wall, thick with tension, suffocating in its silence. Captain Paul Kendrick sat at the controls, his hands steady, but his eyes sharp as knives. Beside him, on the in-flight operations screen, Henry Grayson, one of the airline's highest-ranking executives, stared back, his face a mask of calm authority. Victor stood to the side, arms crossed, his presence a quiet threat. Miss Carter's heart pounded against her ribs. Henry's voice came through the speakers, steady but edged with ice. "I need you to explain why you refused a VIP passenger her seat." Her mouth turned to sand. I didn't refuse," she stammered. "I thought there was a mistake with her ticket." Henry tilted his head slightly. "Did you verify that mistake before asking her to step aside?" Miss Carter's silence was answer enough. Captain Kendrick sighed, rubbing his temple as if her incompetence physically pained him. Victor's gaze bore into her, unrelenting. "Answer the question," he demanded. She swallowed hard. "No," she admitted, the word barely audible. Henry exhaled through his nose, a sound that carried more weight than a shout. "Miss Carter, do you know who that woman is?" Her fingers twitched against her uniform, her mind racing. She was just an old woman, just another passenger, right? But the look in Henry's eyes told her she'd missed something massive. Seeing her hesitation, his voice dropped, colder than before. "Her name is Margaret Holloway. She's the chairwoman of this airline." The words hit like a thunderclap. Miss Carter's breath vanished, her vision blurring at the edges. Margaret Holloway, the founder, the woman who'd built this airline from nothing, who held more power than anyone in this cockpit combined. And she'd slapped her hand, in front of everyone. Henry's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, slow and deliberate. "The woman who created this company, and you humiliated her in front of an entire boarding gate." Miss Carter's knees buckled, but she caught herself against the wall. Captain Kendrick glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Victor didn't bother hiding his disgust. Henry delivered the final blow. "You will fix this immediately, or you will not have a job when this plane lands." Her throat tightened, her pulse a relentless drumbeat in her ears. Margaret Holloway, chairwoman, founder, the most powerful woman in the airline. How had she not known? How had she been so blind? She forced herself to speak, her voice a hollow shell. "I didn't know," she whispered. Victor's voice sliced through the cockpit, sharp and unforgiving. "Didn't know? Or didn't care? She didn't meet your little standard for VIP, did she?" Miss Carter flinched, the accusation piercing her like a shard of glass. Henry interrupted, his tone final. "Miss Carter, if you'd recognized her name, would you have treated her the same way?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. They all knew the answer. If she'd known who Margaret was, she'd have rolled out the red carpet, offered her champagne, begged for her approval. She wouldn't have dared question her ticket, let alone strike her. Her silence screamed the truth louder than any defense could. The weight of the room crushed her. Captain Kendrick shifted in his seat, his patience visibly waning. Victor shook his head, his jaw tight with disappointment. Henry gave a slow nod, as if he'd expected nothing less. "You will return to Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice a guillotine. You will offer her a full public apology in front of the passengers you disrespected her before. Then you will personally escort her for the rest of this flight and ensure she's treated with the respect she deserves. Miss Carter's stomach twisted into knots. Sir, This is not a request, Henry snapped. This is the only thing keeping you employed. Refuse and you won't finish this flight in uniform. She had no choice. Shame burned through her like wildfire as she nodded stiffly. Understood, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. No one spoke as she turned and left the cockpit, their silence a condemnation heavier than words. The moment she stepped back into the VIP cabin, the shift was palpable. Passengers glanced her way, some subtle, some blatant. They knew something had happened. Maybe not the full story, but enough. The murmurs from the gate had followed her here, and now every step toward Margaret Holloway felt like a march to the gallows. Margaret sat in her seat, her posture relaxed, her umbrella resting beside her like a silent sentinel. Sophie lingered nearby, watching cautiously, unsure what was coming. Miss Carter stopped beside Margaret, her hands trembling as she forced the words out. Mrs. Holloway, she began, her voice cracking. She swallowed hard and tried again. I need to apologize for how I treated you earlier. Margaret turned her head slowly, her piercing eyes locking onto Miss Carter's. There was no anger there, no triumph, just a quiet, unreadable depth that made Miss Carter feel smaller than she'd ever felt. The moment stretched, passengers craning their necks, Sophie holding her breath. Miss Carter's shame deepened. She'd treated this woman like a nuisance, like she didn't belong, and now she was the one begging for forgiveness. I misjudged you, she continued, her voice shaking. I was wrong, and I sincerely apologize. Margaret studied her, then tilted her head slightly. Apologize for what, exactly? The question hit like a punch. Miss Carter wanted to shrink away, to end this nightmare, but she couldn't. She had to face it. I assumed you didn't belong in the VIP cabin, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I treated you unfairly and disrespected you in front of everyone. Margaret let the words hang there, heavy and raw, ensuring Miss Carter felt every ounce of their weight. Then, with a single nod, she said, Thank you for your apology. Miss Carter exhaled, thinking it was over. But Margaret picked up her glass of water, took a slow sip, and spoke again. Now tell them. The air shifted. Miss Carter blinked, dread pooling in her gut. Tell who? Margaret gestured toward the passengers, the ones who'd seen her snap, who'd heard the slap, who'd watched this unfold. I've accepted your apology, she said, setting her glass down with a soft clink. But they need to hear it, too. Miss Carter's face drained of color. A cold wave of panic crashed over her. Apologizing to Margaret had been humiliating enough, but now this? In front of everyone? The passengers stared openly now, waiting, their curiosity a tangible force pressing against her. She could feel Victor's words echoing in her mind, Henry's ultimatum ringing in her ears. She had no choice. Swallowing hard, she turned to face the cabin, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. She started, her voice faltering. The moment felt too big, too raw. She glanced toward Victor, now standing at the front of the cabin, his arms crossed, his eyes cold with expectation. She'd dug this grave, now she had to lie in it. I need to apologize to all of you, she said louder, forcing her voice to carry. A ripple of surprise moved through the cabin. Ethan sat up straighter, his brow lifting. Clara watched with quiet satisfaction, her earlier shock replaced by something sharper. Earlier, before we boarded, I made an assumption about a passenger, Miss Carter continued, her pride bleeding out with every word. An assumption that was wrong. I treated Mrs. Holloway unfairly. I questioned her place in the VIP cabin when I had no right to. She paused, her throat tightening, the next words like shards of glass, and I put my hands on her in a way that was completely inappropriate. The cabin buzzed now, some passengers exchanging stunned glances, others nodding as if they'd known all along. They'd seen it, the slap, the cold dismissal, but hearing her admit it, Hearing her voice crack as she laid herself bare made it hit harder. Miss Carter's pulse thundered in her ears, but she lifted her chin, owning it even as it tore her apart. "What I did was unprofessional, uncalled for, and unacceptable," she said, her voice softening. "And for that, I sincerely apologize." A heavy silence fell. She'd hoped for something, forgiveness, dismissal, anything. But the passengers just stared, their judgment a weight she couldn't escape. Then Margaret spoke, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Thank you for your apology, Miss Carter. But I hope you understand something." Miss Carter turned back to her, dread pooling in her chest. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes piercing. "If I were just another elderly woman, if I weren't who I am, do you think you'd be standing here right now?" The question struck like lightning. Miss Carter's breath hitched. She knew the answer. They all did. If Margaret hadn't been the chairwoman, there'd have been no Victor, no Henry, no consequences. She'd have moved on, smug and unchallenged, while some nameless passenger walked away humiliated. The passengers shifted, some averting their eyes, others staring harder, waiting for her to lie. "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I wouldn't." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then leaned back with a small, knowing nod. Miss Carter turned, desperate to escape the spotlight, but Victor's voice stopped her cold. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone heavy, "escort Mrs. Holloway for the remainder of this flight, personally." Her heart sank. This wasn't just punishment, it was a public tethering to her mistake. Margaret, meanwhile, picked up a book from her bag and opened it with a calm flick of her wrist, the message clear. This was far from over. "Tell me, have you ever been judged like that, assumed to be less than you are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories." The plane hummed steadily at cruising altitude, the soft drone of the engines a deceptive lullaby against the storm raging inside Miss Carter's chest. She stood at the front of the VIP cabin, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide the tremor that wouldn't leave them. Every pair of eyes in the cabin felt like a needle pricking her skin, passengers stealing glances, some subtle, some brazen, all carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed at the gate. She'd apologized, publicly humbled herself before them, but it hadn't erased the moment. It hadn't erased the sound of Margaret Holloway's umbrella hitting the floor, or the echo of her own voice snapping, "I told you to move." And now, Victor Ramsey's command tethered her to the very woman she'd wronged. Escort Mrs. Holloway for the remainder of this flight, personally. Margaret sat in her seat near the window, her emerald green coat draped neatly over the armrest, her umbrella resting against the side like a quiet guardian. She turned the pages of her book with a slow, deliberate grace, her face serene as if the chaos of the boarding gate had never happened. But every now and then, her sharp blue eyes flickered toward Miss Carter, not with malice, not with judgment, just watching. That calm observation cut deeper than any reprimand ever could. Miss Carter felt it in her bones. Margaret wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting every flaw Miss Carter had refused to see. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into its rhythm, but there was no peace for Miss Carter. She moved through her duties on autopilot, pouring drinks, adjusting trays, offering tight-lipped smiles to passengers who now looked at her differently. Ethan Brooks, the businessman who'd offered Margaret his seat, caught her eye as she passed. He swirled his glass of bourbon, his gaze steady, but not unkind. "Rough day," he said, his tone low, almost conversational. Miss Carter forced a nod, her throat too tight to respond. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You know, I've flown this route a dozen times, never seen anything like that." He paused, taking a slow sip. "Makes you wonder how many times it's happened before, just without someone like her to call it out." The words landed like a stone in her gut. She wanted to snap back, to tell him he didn't understand, that she'd been doing her job, but she couldn't, because he was right. How many times had she dismissed someone without a second thought? How many passengers had walked away from her flights, carrying the quiet sting of her judgment. She turned away without a word, her chest aching with something she couldn't name. Further down the aisle, Clara Morton watched her too, her soft brown eyes flickering with a mix of pity and curiosity. Clara had gasped when Miss Carter struck Margaret's hand. Miss Carter could still hear that sharp intake of breath, a sound that had pierced the silence like a cry. Now, as Miss Carter adjusted a tray table nearby, Clara spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "I've been flying for years," she said quietly. "My husband and I, we saved up for trips like this. And every time I've seen people like you, people who think they can decide who belongs where. But I've never seen someone stand up to it like she did." Miss Carter froze, her fingers tightening around the tray. Clara's words weren't cruel, but they cut all the same. "I didn't mean," she started, but Clara shook her head. "You did," Clara said simply. "You just didn't think it'd come back to you." Miss Carter's breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the truth in Clara's eyes silenced her. She nodded stiffly and moved on, the weight of the cabin pressing harder against her shoulders. Every step felt like wading through quicksand, every glance a reminder that she wasn't in control anymore. She'd spent years commanding these flights, enforcing rules, maintaining order, but now she was the one being judged, and the verdict was already written in the air. When she reached Margaret's seat, she hesitated. The older woman had set her book aside and was gazing out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly below, like a sea of white. Miss Carter's hands shook as she carried a fresh glass of water, the simple task suddenly monumental. She cleared her throat softly. I brought you some water, Mrs. Holloway," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Margaret turned her head, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Thank you," she said, reaching for the glass. Miss Carter set it down, but her nerves betrayed her. The glass wobbled, tipping slightly before settling with a soft clink. She never fumbled, not in 10 years of service, but now her hands were traitors, trembling under Margaret's steady gaze. She pulled them back quickly, straightening her posture as if that could hide her unraveling. Margaret noticed, of course she did. She took a slow sip of water, then set the glass down with care. "You've been with this airline a long time, haven't you?" she asked, her tone conversational but piercing. Miss Carter stiffened. "Yes, ma'am," she said cautiously. 10 years. Margaret nodded, her eyes searching Miss Carter's face. "And in all that time, has anyone ever told you that you didn't belong here?" The question hit like a freight train. Miss Carter's stomach twisted, her mind racing back through a decade of flights. Every crisp uniform, every confident stride down the aisle, every passenger who'd nodded at her with respect. No one had ever questioned her place. She'd walked these cabins like she owned them, her authority unquestioned, her judgment final. But that was exactly what she'd done to Margaret, stripped her of that same dignity without a second thought. "No," Miss Carter admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They haven't." Margaret let the silence stretch, her gaze unrelenting. "Then why did you think you could do that to me?" Miss Carter's breath caught, her chest tightening until it hurt to breathe. She wanted to look away, to run, to hide from those words, but she couldn't. Margaret wasn't accusing her. She was asking her to see, to really see. And for the first time, Miss Carter did. She saw the arrogance in her snap judgments, the cruelty in her assumptions, the power she'd wielded without care. She saw herself through Margaret's eyes, and she hated what she saw. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice breaking. It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession. "I don't know why I did it." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in her seat. "Then you'd better figure it out," she said simply, her tone soft but firm as iron. She picked up her book again, turning her attention back to the pages as if the conversation were over. But it wasn't over, not for Miss Carter. Those words clung to her like damp cloth, heavy and cold, sinking into her skin. She turned away, retreating to the galley where she could hide, at least for a moment. The small space felt like a lifeline, a place to catch her breath. but even there, she couldn't escape. Victor Ramsay stood near the counter, his arms crossed, his eyes tracking her every move. "You're struggling," he said, his voice low but cutting. Miss Carter bristled, her pride flaring despite everything. "I'm fine," she muttered, reaching for a tray of napkins she didn't need. Victor shook his head. "No, you're not." He stepped closer, his presence towering. "You've been doing this job long enough to know better, Carter. You assumed something about her, and it wasn't about her ticket. It was about what you thought a VIP passenger should look like." The accusation stung, sharp and precise, slicing through the defenses she'd been clinging to. "I didn't mean—" "It doesn't matter what you meant," Victor interrupted, his voice firm. "It matters what you did, and what you did was wrong." Miss Carter's fingers dug into the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening. She wanted to argue, to push back, but the fight drained out of her. "I already apologized," she said, her voice flat. Victor studied her, his gaze piercing. "Yeah, you did, but do you even know why?" The question stopped her cold. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She'd apologized because she'd been told to, because her job was on the line, because Margaret Holloway was the chairwoman. But why had she done it in the first place? Why had she looked at an elderly woman with an umbrella and decided she didn't belong? She turned away, busying herself with the napkins, but Victor's voice followed her. "Figure it out, Carter," he said quietly, "or this isn't going to end with an apology." He stepped back, leaving her alone in the galley with nothing but the hum of the plane and the weight of her own thoughts. She pressed her hands against the counter, staring down at the polished surface as if it held answers. She'd spent years believing she was good at her job, efficient, strict, in control. But now she saw the truth. She'd been enforcing her own rules, not the airline's. Rules built on snap judgments and unspoken biases. And today, those rules had crumbled, leaving her exposed. The flight dragged on, each minute an eternity. Miss Carter kept moving, kept working, but every time she passed Margaret's seat, the older woman's presence loomed larger. Margaret didn't demand anything, didn't ask for extra water, didn't ring the call button. She just existed, a quiet force that Miss Carter couldn't ignore. And every glance from the passengers, Ethan's knowing smirks, Clara's quiet stares, reminded her that she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the story now, the lesson unfolding in real time. At one point, she brought a blanket to an elderly passenger a few rows behind Margaret. The woman smiled up at her, her wrinkled hands trembling as she took it. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice frail but warm. Miss Carter nodded, but as she turned away, she caught Margaret watching her. Not judging, not accusing, just watching. And in that moment, Miss Carter wondered, how many times have I dismissed someone like her? How many times have I decided they didn't belong? The thought gnawed at her, a splinter she couldn't pull out. She retreated to the galley again, her hands shaking as she poured herself a cup of coffee she wouldn't drink. The intercom crackled to life, snapping her out of her spiral. Captain Paul Kendrick's voice came through, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Miss Carter straightened, brushing off her uniform as if she could shake off the dread pooling in her chest. She moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, securing trays, her motions mechanical. But her mind was elsewhere, back at the gate, back in the cockpit, back in every moment she'd failed to see what was right in front of her. She reached Margaret's seat last. The older woman was already buckled in, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the city lights growing closer below. For a moment, Miss Carter just stood there, the words she wanted to say trapped in her throat. Then Margaret spoke, her voice soft but piercing. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Miss Carter tensed. "Thinking about what?" she asked, though she knew. Margaret turned to face her, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "About why you did it." The plane jolted slightly as the landing gear lowered, the familiar shift in pressure signaling the end of the flight. But inside the cabin, everything felt too still, too heavy. Miss Carter's breath caught. Margaret was right. She'd been thinking about it since the cockpit, since the apology, since Victor's words had carved into her. And now, standing here, she had no excuses left. "I don't know why I did it," she admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know." Margaret studied her, her expression softening just enough to notice. "Then figure it out," she said, her tone gentle but resolute. "Because if you don't, you'll carry this with you forever." The plane touched down with a smooth thud, the wheels kissing the runway as a quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked as passengers shifted, but Miss Carter stood frozen, Margaret's words echoing in her mind. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, polished and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today." But Miss Carter felt no relief. She looked toward the boarding tunnel, knowing whatever waited beyond it wouldn't be simple. Victor was already on the in-flight phone, speaking quietly with ground operations, his posture tense. Margaret reached for her handbag and umbrella, moving with that same unhurried grace. But when her eyes met Miss Carter's again, the weight behind them was heavier now. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to rise, gathering their belongings with the usual post-flight rustle. Ethan stood, adjusting his suit jacket, and cast Miss Carter a final glance. "Good luck," he said, his tone neutral, but laced with something she couldn't place. He stepped into the tunnel and vanished. Miss Carter braced herself, turning back to Margaret. The older woman adjusted her coat, gripping her umbrella lightly. Then she spoke, her voice calm but commanding. "Walk with me." Miss Carter blinked. "Excuse me?" Margaret nodded toward the tunnel. "Walk with me," she repeated, and it wasn't a request. Victor's voice cut through her hesitation. "Go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miss Carter exhaled sharply, nodding stiffly. As Margaret stepped off the plane, she followed, the tap of the umbrella against the floor a steady rhythm marking their path. The walk through the boarding tunnel felt endless, the air shifting as they approached the International Airport terminal. Passengers parted naturally for Margaret, drawn by an authority Miss Carter hadn't seen until it was too late. Then she saw them, standing near a restricted entrance, a group of airline executives, Henry Grayson at the center, flanked by security officers. Her breath hitched, her steps faltering, but Margaret kept walking, undeterred. The closer they got, the more Miss Carter felt her world closing in. Henry stepped forward, offering Margaret a respectful nod. "Mrs. Holloway," he said smoothly. "I trust the flight was illuminating." Margaret's lips curled into a faint smile. "Oh, it was." Henry's gaze shifted to Miss Carter, cool and unyielding. "Miss Carter, we need to have a conversation." Her stomach dropped. "Sir, Not here," Henry interrupted, holding up a hand. He gestured toward the glass doors ahead. "Come with us." Margaret took a step forward, her voice steady. "She'll take full responsibility for her actions," she said, her eyes locking onto Miss Carter's. "Won't you?" Miss Carter's throat tightened. She'd thought the flight was her punishment. The apology, the humiliation, the stares. But this was something else. Standing before the airline's top brass, security at their side, she realized this was only the beginning. Her career, her reputation, her entire future, it all hung in the balance. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she could save it. What would you have done in her shoes? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to own up to something this big? Let me know in the comments. I'm dying to hear your thoughts. The glass doors of the management office loomed ahead, the airline's emblem etched across them like a silent judge. Miss Carter followed Henry Grayson and the cluster of executives, her steps heavy, each one echoing with the dread that had been building since the plane touched down. Margaret Holloway walked beside her, her umbrella tapping lightly against the polished floor, a sound that had become a metronome to Miss Carter's unraveling. The security officers trailed behind, their presence a quiet threat, not quite an arrest, but close enough to make her pulse race. Passengers in the International Airport terminal glanced their way, some with open curiosity, others turning quickly to avoid the scene. But Miss Carter felt every stare, every whisper, pressing against her like a tide she couldn't escape. Henry swiped his badge, and the doors parted with a soft hiss. He gestured for her to step inside, his expression unreadable, but firm. Miss Carter hesitated, her eyes darting to Margaret. The older woman met her gaze, calm as ever, her piercing blue eyes carrying a weight that made Miss Carter's chest ache. There was no anger there, no triumph, just expectation. A silent demand that Miss Carter face what she'd done. She swallowed hard, turned away, and stepped through the doors. They shut behind her with a quiet thud, sealing her fate. The management office was stark and cold, the long table gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. At its head sat Leonard Hayes, the senior operations manager, his sharp gray eyes locking onto Miss Carter the moment she entered. Two other executives flanked him, folders stacked neatly before them, her file, no doubt. The security officers took their posts near the door, silent sentinels watching her every move. Leonard leaned forward, lacing his fingers together, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence. "Sit."
Miss Carter obeyed, lowering herself into the chair at the far end of the table. Her back was stiff, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. Leonard's gaze didn't waver. "You know why you're here," he said, his tone even but heavy with authority. She forced a nod. "Yes, sir." He studied her, his expression a mask of steel. "Then tell me what happened on that flight." The question felt like a trap, a noose tightening around her neck. Her first instinct was to deflect, to soften the edges of the truth, to explain it away as a misunderstanding. But she'd spent the entire flight running from that truth, on the plane, in the galley, in every glance from Margaret, and she couldn't run anymore. She inhaled sharply, her voice trembling but resolute. "I made an assumption about a passenger," she admitted. "I looked at Mrs. Holloway, and I decided she didn't belong in the VIP cabin. I didn't check her ticket properly. I didn't listen when she corrected me. And when she didn't step aside, Her throat tightened, the words clawing at her. I put my hands on her." Leonard didn't react. No nod, no frown, just a steady stare that made her feel smaller with every passing second. She pressed on, the confessions spilling out like blood from a wound. "I humiliated her in front of everyone. I treated her like she was nothing when she's—" Her voice broke, and she forced herself to finish. "When she's everything to this airline." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Leonard leaned back, his chair creaking faintly. "Do you realize what you just admitted to?" Miss Carter's fingers curled against her thighs. "Yes," she whispered. Leonard flipped open the folder in front of him, his eyes skimming the pages. "We have statements from passengers, a report from Captain Kendrick, a formal complaint from Mrs. Holloway herself." Her breath hitched. She hadn't known Margaret had filed a complaint, and the realization hit like a punch to the gut. Leonard closed the folder with a soft snap, his hands resting on the table. "You've been with this airline for 10 years, Miss Carter. 10 years. What you did is grounds for immediate termination." Her stomach clenched. The words she'd feared now real and raw. She'd expected them, braced for them, but hearing them aloud made her vision blur. Leonard's gaze sharpened. "The only reason you're still sitting here instead of being escorted out of this building is because Mrs. Holloway insisted we give you a chance to speak before we decide." Miss Carter's head snapped up, her heart stuttering. She did?" Leonard nodded, his expression unchanging. "She did." Confusion flooded her. After everything, the slap, the humiliation, the disrespect, why would Margaret fight for her to have a voice? She glanced toward the glass doors where Margaret sat in the lounge outside, her silhouette framed against the terminal lights. She was waiting, watching, her umbrella resting beside her like a quiet promise. Miss Carter didn't understand, but for the first time since stepping into this room, she felt a flicker of something new. Not fear, not shame, but a fragile, desperate hope. She turned back to Leonard, her throat tight but her voice steadying. "I know I deserve to be fired," she said, quietly. "I've spent 10 years thinking I was good at this job, thinking I knew who belonged where, thinking I could decide that for people. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Her eyes burned, but she blinked back the tears, lifting her chin. "I don't want my last moment here to be about what I did wrong. I want to prove I can learn from it." Leonard raised an eyebrow, the first crack in his stoic facade. "And how do you plan to do that?" Miss Carter hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't have a clear answer, not yet, but she knew she couldn't let this be the end. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice raw. "I don't expect to walk out of here with everything intact. But if you give me a chance, I want to help fix what I broke. Not just for me, but for every passenger I've ever dismissed. I want to be part of making this airline better than I left it." The room fell silent again, her words hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Leonard studied her, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. The other executives exchanged glances, their expressions guarded. She didn't know if she'd said enough, if she'd said anything that mattered, but it was the truth, stripped bare, and it was all she had left. Leonard exhaled slowly. "Wait outside," he instructed. Miss Carter nodded, rising stiffly from her chair. The security officers didn't move to escort her this time, and she clung to that small mercy as she stepped back into the lounge. Her breath shook as she emerged, and then she saw her, Margaret Holloway, still seated, still waiting. Their eyes met, and for the first time Miss Carter didn't look away. She stood there, exposed, vulnerable, but unwilling to hide. Margaret set her handbag on her lap, her movements deliberate. "They're deciding your future in there," she said, nodding toward the office. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but it carried a weight that rooted Miss Carter to the spot. "I know," Miss Carter replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "And what do you think they'll decide?" Miss Carter swallowed, the question pressing against her chest. An hour ago, she'd have fought tooth and nail to save her job, scrambling for excuses, clinging to her pride. Now, she wasn't sure she deserved it. "I don't know," she admitted. "It depends on whether they think I can change." Margaret tapped her fingers lightly against her umbrella, her gaze piercing. "Can you?" The question wasn't cruel, but it cut deep. Miss Carter's hands twitched at her sides, her voice trembling as she answered. "I want to try." Margaret gave a soft hum, not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. It felt heavier than any verdict. Miss Carter took a shaky breath, then asked the question that had been burning inside her since the flight. "Why did you ask them to let me speak? After everything I did, why?" Margaret's lips curled slightly, a ghost of a smile. "Because I wanted to see what you do with it," she said. "Whether you defend yourself or face yourself." Miss Carter's stomach sank. It hadn't been mercy. It hadn't been kindness. It had been a test, a chance to prove whether she could look at her own mistakes and not flinch. And standing there, under Margaret's unwavering gaze, she realized she'd been given more than she deserved. Not a lifeline, but a mirror. "You could have had me fired on the spot," Miss Carter said, her voice cracking. "You still could." Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "Yes," she said, simply. "Then why didn't you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the handle of her umbrella. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resolute. "Because I don't believe in letting people walk away from their mistakes without learning something. Firing you would have been easy. For me, for them. But it wouldn't have changed you. The words pierced her, sharp and true, sending a tremor through her chest. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. Margaret Holloway, the woman who'd built this airline from the ground up, who'd faced 1,000 battles to get here, hadn't needed Miss Carter's apology. She'd needed her to see, to understand, to grow. And now, for the first time, Miss Carter did. The doors to the management office opened, and she turned, her breath catching as Leonard Hayes stepped out. The other executives followed, their postures rigid, their eyes flickering briefly to Margaret, before settling on Miss Carter. Henry Grayson lingered at the threshold, his voice steady as he spoke. "We've made our decision." Miss Carter braced herself, her hands curling at her sides. Leonard studied her, his gaze cold but not cruel. "Effective immediately. You're being placed on probation." Her breath hitched. Probation, not termination, not forgiveness, but a middle ground she hadn't dared hope for. Leonard continued, his tone firm. "You'll undergo mandatory training. Leadership, anti-bias, conflict resolution. Your performance will be monitored for the next 8 months. One misstep, and you're gone. No second chances after this." Miss Carter's knees trembled, but she held herself upright. It wasn't a reprieve, it was a gauntlet, a chance to prove she could be better, with the weight of her mistake hanging over her every move. Leonard's eyes narrowed. "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Good." Leonard glanced at Margaret. "Mrs. Holloway approved this decision. If she'd wanted you gone, you'd be packing your things right now." Miss Carter turned to Margaret, her heart pounding. The older woman met her gaze, unflinching. She hadn't saved Miss Carter's job out of pity. She'd given her a chance to earn it, and now it was hers to lose. "Thank you," Miss Carter said quietly, the words raw and real. Margaret gave a slow nod. "Make it mean something," she said, her voice a quiet command. Then with a final tap of her umbrella, she rose and turned away, her emerald green coat trailing behind her as she walked toward the terminal exit. The rhythmic sound of her steps faded into the crowd, leaving Miss Carter standing alone. Leonard's voice pulled her back. "Report to training headquarters Monday morning. You'll get your instructions there." She nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." He gave her one last look, then turned and walked away with the others, their footsteps echoing down the hall. Miss Carter stood there, the terminal buzzing around her, passengers coming and going, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just happened in her world. She exhaled slowly, unclenching her fists, and turned to the windows overlooking the tarmac. Planes lined up in neat rows, their engines silent for now, waiting for the next journey. She thought about the passengers she'd served over the years, the ones she'd smiled at, the ones she'd ignored, the ones she'd judged without ever knowing their stories. How many had walked away from her flights feeling small? How many had looked into her eyes and seen the same arrogance she'd shown Margaret? The thought twisted in her gut, sharp and unrelenting. But it wasn't despair, it was clarity. For the first time in 10 years, she saw herself, not the flight attendant she'd pretended to be, but the woman she'd become. And she didn't like her. But maybe, just maybe, she could change her. The terminal lights reflected off the glass, casting her faint silhouette against the night sky. She'd been given a second chance, not a clean slate, not a gift, but a test. 8 months to prove she could be more than her mistakes. 8 months to learn what Margaret Holloway had known all along. That power wasn't in a uniform or a title, but in the way you treated the people who crossed your path. She thought of Margaret's words, "Make it mean something," and felt them settle into her bones. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a harder one, a truer one. She'd spent a decade enforcing rules, maintaining control, deciding who belonged. Now she had to unlearn it all. She had to listen. She had to see. And for the first time, she wanted to. With a final glance at the planes outside, Miss Carter turned and walked toward the exit. The terminal hummed with life, but she moved through it differently now. Not with the brisk confidence of before, but with a quiet, uncertain purpose. She didn't know if she could pass this test. She didn't know if she deserved to. But she knew one thing. She'd never forget the sound of that umbrella hitting the floor, or the woman who'd picked it up and shown her what strength really looked like. As she stepped into the cool night air, the weight of the day pressed against her. But it wasn't crushing anymore. It was heavy, yes, but it was hers to carry. And maybe, just maybe, she could turn it into something worth holding on to. If this story touched you, if it made you laugh, cry, or think, please let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Miss Carter's place? Have you ever had to face a mistake that changed you? Share your thoughts below, and if you love this journey, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. You mean the world to me.